We've all heard the rumors by now of Scott Drew to Indiana, but honestly, guys, does Indiana even want Scott Drew? Does Indiana deserve Scott Drew? Let's cross it over with Locked On Hoosiers here on Locked On Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It's a Locked On crossover edition, Hoosiers and Baylor. That's right, with the coaching search and the rumors flying around like crazy for who's going to be the next head basketball coach of the Indiana Hoosiers, we may as well bring in our guy Cam Stewart from Locked On Baylor and see, are the rumors true? Is Scott Drew going to leave Baylor to come to IU? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But Cam, it seems like his name is always floating around. When there's a big job opening, knock, 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 Scott Drew's right there.
There's a time of year every year, Jacob, where we know it's coming. I mean, it's kind of the running joke in football in the Big 12. Matt Campbell is up for every job, yes. And it seems that way. It's happened a lot in basketball too. And this year we just get it a little bit earlier than normal. Last year we were on pins and needles early April with that Kentucky opening, and certainly they really wanted Scott. But yeah, pretty much every year, definitely every other year, one of these jobs comes open. Duke came open the year after they won the national championship at Baylor. UNC was the year that Baylor won the national championship. Now we got Kentucky last year, Indiana this year. It's like clockwork every time. We're flattered.
But there's reason for it, right? I mean, you're talking about a guy that's, and I said it the other day on Locked On Hoosiers, I said, we're talking about a Final Four coach, and then I had to stop myself and say, no, wait, we're talking about a national championship winning coach who's got a nearly 65% winning percentage that during his time at Baylor has made the tournament more than he's missed it. I mean, the respect is deserved. Scott Drew is one of the best coaches in America.
Yeah, there's only so many coaches, and that number is dwindling of active national champion head coaches.
Yeah.
There's no more Krzyzewski. There's no more Williams. There's no more Wright. It's Izzo, Scott Drew, Hurley. I almost said Bobby Hurley. That's far from correct. Danny Hurley. There's not many. I don't know how many more there is than that. So you're talking about a pretty elite company, And the other thing too is those numbers. Baylor's not having a great year this year. That'll be part of this story. But when you look at those numbers, you got to also remember where he started. I mean, we all know the story so well at Baylor, but he comes in 2003. They have one of the worst scandals in the history of college sports. I mean, a player killed his teammate and the coach covered it up. Like you're starting at ground zero would be flattering to that particular situation. Sure. So that's the other thing too. There's not many coaches who have that national championship ring that are still in college basketball. And for whatever this is worth, there's nobody in college basketball right now that's had the turnaround that Scott Drew's had at the place that he is. Typically, when you have a turnaround of that magnitude, you get another big job, right? Or a bigger job. And B, there's just not many turnarounds like that. So, I don't know if that's exactly what IU's looking for. They're like, who had the biggest turnaround of a program? And certainly what Chris Beard did at Tech was pretty incredible as well. But if you're talking about the great rebuilds in the history of college sports, Baylor men's basketball, even though it took 18 years to get from that point A to the national championship of point B, he had them within an incorrect ref call of the Final Four in 2010. Right. We're talking about a story and a guy who has rebuilt something the likes of which you can't replicate amongst active coaches in college basketball.
I mean, you talk about rebuilds and several other names. I know you've been kind of keeping track of what's happening with this coaching search for obvious reasons, but talk about Bruce Pearl at Auburn, Nate Oates in Alabama. I mean, you're talking about names, and Chris Beard again, who's brought Ole Miss up to the relevancy line. I mean, Mick Cronin and UCLA, like big time names of coaches that have proven they've done it before, which is why I think Scott Drew's name is being thrown around. And it seems like there may be interest both sides. But let's be honest here. Everything right now, with it being in the middle of the season, is kind of just hearsay. We try to figure out what is real, what is not, who's really interested in what. And it's in the middle of the season. And you mentioned it, Baylor not having their best year under Scott Drew, but I think one thing I like so much about him is he's just consistent. He's a defensive guy. He wins big time games, and he's also been loyal to Baylor. And I think that's something that may stick out to IU if they make the call.
Yeah, and that's what makes this such an interesting thing. And really every year when Scott Drew's name comes up, it's at this point, and I know we'll talk about this in the next segment, Baylor fans are like, how is he going to leave? He just turned down Kentucky last year. Like once we made it past that, like we feel like we're comfortable. And the only time that it was close for Scott Drew, and my old radio partner, Matt Mosley, who was following this the whole time, is swears by this. The only time it was really close was 2008, I want to say, maybe 07. I could be off by a year or two there. You know what? It would have been after 08 because it's when Calipari left Memphis. And they really wanted Scott, and Scott was really close to signing the dotted line. They go with Josh Pastner instead. And so ever since then, from that point till last year, there was a bunch of rumors and nothing really came even close to that Kentucky one last year. So that loyalty has been there. And he said it after turning down Kentucky was, Waco, I've been here for 20 years now. Like this is my place. My kids were raised here. He's got a daughter at Baylor. This is a place where he can be, I don't want to say he can be a god because we're a Baptist school. We don't joke like that. But he can be the number one guy in town versus the intense criticism that would come with a Kentucky. And of course, an intense criticism that would come with Indiana as well. That's the nature of the beast.
Sure. And that's been a big conversation about not just Scott Drew, but all these names is, do they want the pressure? Do they want the spotlight? I mean, Scott Drew seems to be pretty comfortable in Baylor, where I don't think they're going to get rid of him anytime soon. It's if he just wants something new. And whether he does or whether he doesn't, we're going to find out. And the question is, will he leave? Would he do it? Will he leave Baylor to come to Bloomington? We'll talk about that, why it makes sense for him, why it makes sense for Indiana, or why it just doesn't at all. We'll talk about that coming up next in this Locked On crossover edition between Hoosiers and Baylor. Today's episode on this Locked On crossover is brought to you by Fabric. Life moves fast, especially when you have a family. One day you're watching your kids take their first steps, and before you know it, they're off to college. That's why securing their future is so important. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it simple to get term life insurance that fits your family's needs. With Fabric, you can apply for term life insurance online right now from your couch. You can be covered in under 10 minutes, and in many cases, no health exam is required. You have a peace of mind for all those parents out there. Don't you want to make sure that your family is financially protected no matter what happens? Fabric gives you that peace of mind. And it's not just life insurance. Fabric also offers free digital wills and access to investment accounts to help plan for your children's future. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. That's MEET fabric.com/lockedoncollege. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. All right, welcome back to this Locked On crossover, Locked On Hoosiers. I'm your man, Jacob Goins, Cam Stewart from Locked On Baylor. And the big question, it's the one everybody wants to know that we may not know the actual answer to, but we're going to give it our best shot here, Cam. Will Scott Drew leave Baylor to be the next head coach at Indiana? And I think a deeper question is, does it make sense? Let's start with Scott Drew. We'll get your perspective on that, and I'll give the perspective from IU. Does it make sense, after all the things we just talked about, for Scott Drew to leave a place he's comfortable, leave a place he's won, and take on a new challenge at IU?
I'm going to say no. And I think, and of course I'm a podcaster, so I'll give you a 10-minute answer for a 30-second answer. But I think a lot of the Baylor fan base thinks 100% no, there's just no chance, right? And I totally get that. Again, what we went through with the Kentucky thing last year was once he said no to that, it's like there's no way he's leaving. But I will say I'm a little less sure. And by that, I mean I give it like a 5% chance. Just because where Baylor's at right now, I mean, if you're Scott Drew, I don't want to say you can't take them any higher, because you could, in theory, win more national championships. You could go to the Final Four again. That's not out of the question in college basketball and the level that Baylor's gotten to. But this has been a very frustrating year. And I think a big part of it is they have NIL money. They don't have Indiana NIL money, but they do have NIL money. And they've had some really good donors the last couple of years giving to this program. That's how you get to, competitive teams after the national championship, because that was barely pre-NIL. That's right. How you get a new arena like you've got. And that's how you have at least 3 players on the roster making more than $500,000 this year. At Baylor for basketball, that's a big deal. And this season has fallen way flat. Like, they're battling to stay in the tournament picture against Oklahoma State tomorrow. Like, that's not a place you want to be in on March 1st, right?
We understand. We understand.
Yes, I'm glad you can relate to that. But I think there is a world where we're heading into revenue sharing in the next month, right? In April is when that's going to come up. And it's going to be $20.5 million. Baylor's going to opt into that, right? Because they don't have big time collectives. They have a good collective, but not a big time enough where you would decline that option. And Baylor football is on the rise again. And so I think there's a world where a lot of money that was being allocated towards men's basketball is now going to be put more towards football, because they feel they're close to being an Indiana type and getting to the college football playoff. They feel like they're close to that. With the players they have coming back and the belief they have in Coach Dave Aranda. So if that starts to muddy the picture a little bit, because we know we have a good idea that Scott Drew, after turning down Kentucky last year, went to athletic director Mack Rhoades and said, I need a blank check, not for me, for the program. I need the backing to get back to a Final Four. And I see a possibility where there's going to just not be as much money next year. And he's going to say, I'm not going to be able to do what you guys expect us to do now without that kind of money. And you missed an opportunity to cash in on that last year with Kentucky. You were going to have endless resources. And maybe there's a world where it's like, maybe this is a sign. This is the second year in a row I've gotten a program after me that has endless resources when it comes to men's basketball. So that's the only thing I think that could muddy up the picture. But at the end of the day, I'm one of those guys who is like, don't overthink it. He turned down Kentucky. Like, no disrespect to Indiana, because obviously traditionally those two programs are right at the very top. But where they are right now, Kentucky is still in a better position. And for Scott Drew to say no, it just feels like that was maybe the end of the road of prying Scott Drew away.
I think it's a great reasonings and explanations. And I know you've talked about this on Baylor, and I've talked about it on Hoosiers with the state of Indiana connections, the area of the country that it is. And those exist, but how much do those really tie into when a coach sits down, talks with the family, and says, is this what we want to do? And your reasonings for possibly leaving Baylor, they go right in line with what Indiana can offer, which is incredible NIL money, more than most people understand, even with the football stuff with Curt Cignetti, with getting to a playoff, and he walked in and demanded it, and they're giving it to him, and rightfully so. But on the basketball side of things, it almost is endless because of the big money people who want to see this program be relevant, which it really hasn't been since the 90s. And so you get somebody like Scott Drew, who's coached for a long time, who also has a lot of years left, I think. And that's what it comes down to, Cam. I really do think it comes down to, does he want to coach that much longer? If he wants to do 3 to 5 years, I think staying at Baylor is probably the right option. But if he's like, I got 10 or 15 left in me, then maybe Indiana's the move for him. I think it comes with the spotlight. Sure. Right. Yeah. It comes with the pressure. It comes with all the things. If you win at Indiana, you're idolized. I said it the other day, right behind Jesus on Sunday. But if you lose, they want you gone and they never want to see your face again. So do you want to take that if you're Scott Drew? And the question we're asking is, does it make sense? If he wants all of that, yes. If he doesn't want to deal with that, then no, I'm with you. Maybe it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and especially on the age thing, like it's interesting because he's right at the end of in a couple of years, in your mid 50s, late 50s, you don't want to start over. Like, it doesn't really matter. You know where you're going,
right?
Right. Like this is kind of the golden hour. Like if you don't get him now, no one's going to get him just because of the age thing. And the other thing too is his dad obviously was a legend at Valpo, and he gave it up in his early 60s. And some coaches can go longer than that. Some coaches can go into their 70s, and some, like you said, don't want to. And maybe that's a Drew family thing. And that is also another thing here is I've downplayed the Indiana ties. Yes, he's from Indiana, and it is the nature of the state. It's the best basketball state in America. But his dad did coach at another school. Like, you know what I mean? I'm sure he watched plenty of Hoosier basketball, but he was rooting for Valpo his whole life. So there's that part of it too. And I do find it interesting that last part of the pressure situation, because that's what we heard with Kentucky, and plenty of Kentucky fans saying it. And even Baylor analysts who know Scott were saying this. It's like, I don't know that he wants to be in that kind of fishbowl. Like, Baylor fans, they'll get fed up at some point. I don't want to say it's all sunshine and rainbows, but if he misses the tournament the next 5 years and retires, he'll still get a statue. You know what I mean? Yeah. And with Indiana, the other thing too, so Kentucky fans saying, I don't know if he can handle Lexington. I don't know if he can handle BBN and all of that. But Indiana, the other thing too, in terms of making sense, is Scott Drew is not Bobby Knight. All right. That was another thing Kentucky fans were worried about, that he was going to go in there and be all happy and be teaching Sunday school. Scott Drew's not necessarily that, but he ain't throwing a chair across the floor. Right.
That's fair.
And that is a cultural thing, I'm sure, with Hoosiers fans. You want, at this point, it's been 20 years, like you want the right guy, but you also, there is kind of that Indiana basketball culture that we're not just going to brush off some of these losses. Scott Drew loses to Colorado, the worst team in the Big 12 last week. And he's like, just another day in the Big 12. Like, that's not going to fly in Bloomington.
No, it's not.
Even I know that. You know what I mean?
No, it's not.
And so that is, the guy wins a lot, and I think that's paramount. But there are guys like, I think of Bo Pelini at Nebraska, who won quite a bit, but they said, A, he didn't win enough, and B, he's not one of our guys. Yeah. And you could run into that issue at Indiana, even if you're winning and going to the Sweet 16. That's better than where you guys are at right now. But in the long term, Indiana's thinking Final Four national championship with their next home run hire. So if Scott Drew's going to be that, that's where you got to be. And he ain't. He's not going to be throwing chairs across the floor. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we would love that.
Sure. It's funny you say all of that, because that's such a big focus on this hire. And with all the names that I've talked about throughout the last couple of weeks on the show, is there's a fine line between, do you want the Mick Cronins of the world who just kind of piss everybody off along the way, but they win games? Or do you want somebody who's just down to earth and a really nice guy? You've got to have somebody in between. Could Scott Drew be it? Maybe so. And we got to see if Indiana, A, makes the call, if Scott Drew answers, and does he accept it or decline. We're not going to find out for a few more weeks, though, because the seasons are still going on. And I think that's an important factor here, Cam.
Yeah, and who knows? We might get a Baylor Indiana NIT matchup up there at Assembly. That would be great, man. Wouldn't that be nice? And to talk about some of the other candidates there, like obviously I haven't looked into it as much as you have, but with Mick Cronin and Chris Beard, they're both much closer to that Bobby Knight archetype, and they do win a hell of a lot. Like they win everywhere they go. And I really respected Chris Beard in his time at Tech. Those MFers were tough to play against, and obviously they took Tech to the national championship game. Like, again, bringing Bobby Knight into this. Like, we Indiana fans have seen what kind of program Tech is traditionally, and he took them all the way there. And you said, he's bringing Ole Miss to the tournament. They're relevant. They haven't been relevant in so long. So, yeah, both he and Cronin probably fit that kind of mold better, for better or for worse, whether you like that or don't. They fit that mold really well. And they win a lot. They didn't win the national championship like Scott Drew did, but they sure have won a heck of a lot. But yeah, we've got some time here. You can milk this thing out a good couple of weeks, because I don't know when Scott Drew's season's going to be over. But if you're looking at those three guys and for all three of them to be done, you might be talking about a month here.
And we very well could. We'll have to see what happens if Scott Drew could end up being the next head coach in Bloomington for the Indiana Hoosiers. He is Cam Stewart of Locked On Baylor. I'm Jacob Goins of Locked On Hoosiers. Got more coming up here as we wrap up this portion of a Locked On crossover between Hoosiers and Baylor.
Thank you to Jacob for crossing it over with me. I say no. I say Scott Drew does not go to Indiana. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Should he stay or should he go? Give me the clash down in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe. Helps out the channel a ton. And ring that notification bell to get notified every time we're dropping a video on YouTube. And guess what? You can find us wherever you find your podcasts as well. Thank you guys so much for making it your first listen today and every day. We'll see you later on your favorite show, Locked On Baylor.